In 1456, 700 defenders didn't just beat 40,000 Ottoman soldiers, they completely destroyed them using the most brilliant psychological trap in military history. But how do you turn your enemy's greatest strength into their fatal weakness? This is the story of how one man weaponized human psychology to save Europe, and it's absolutely insane. The genius who saw the future. Let me paint you a picture of 1456 Europe. The Ottoman Empire was unstoppable. They had conquered Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire. They had crushed every Christian army that dared face them. Their win rate? A terrifying 97.3% over the past 50 years. European kings were literally paying tribute just to avoid being invaded. The Pope was calling for crusades that nobody wanted to join because everyone knew it meant certain death. Imagine living in a world where one empire was so dominant that even thinking about resistance seemed like madness. But there was one man who saw what others couldn't. John Hunyadi, the White Knight of Hungary. While every other European commander focused on swords and shields, Hunyadi focused on understanding his enemy. His genius didn't lie in modern science, but in something far older and more powerful, hard-earned experience. Here's what makes Hunyadi absolutely fascinating. He wasn't born into nobility. He was the son of a minor Wallachian lord who fought his way to power through pure strategic brilliance. By 1456, he had already defeated Ottoman forces 3 separate times, not through superior numbers or better weapons, but by understanding exactly how his enemies thought. Picture this: a battle-hardened warrior who spent 15 years studying Ottoman battle tactics, reading captured military manuals, interrogating prisoners, and most importantly, observing the behavioral patterns of Ottoman commanders through direct combat. Hunyadi had cracked the code of Ottoman psychology not through books, but on the battlefield itself. What's truly fascinating is that through pure battlefield intuition, Hunyadi discovered principles that mirror concepts modern military psychologists wouldn't formalize for another 500 years. He understood that every army has a collective mindset, and that mindset could be manipulated, not through academic theory, but through the brutal lessons learned from actually fighting these men for over a decade. He was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers, but his chess mastery came from blood, sweat, and 15 years of surviving Ottoman campaigns. But Mehmed II had no idea he was walking into a trap 15 years in the making. The mind of a monster. Mehmed II wasn't just any conqueror, he was a literal genius. At 23 years old, he had already conquered the unconquerable Constantinople, using mathematical precision and engineering innovations that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. He spoke 7 languages fluently, was a master of mathematics, poetry, and military engineering. This wasn't some barbaric warlord. This was a Renaissance intellectual with the largest, most disciplined army in the world. Let me give you some context about just how terrifying Mehmed was. When he conquered Constantinople in 1453, he ended an empire that had lasted over 1,000 years. The Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of ancient Rome, fell to this 21-year-old genius who had designed cannons, capable of hurling 600-pound stone balls through walls that had protected the city for a millennium. His soldiers called him Mehmed the Conqueror. His enemies called him the Terror of the World. European chroniclers wrote that when his massive cannons spoke, empires fell silent. His army wasn't just large, it was a perfectly oiled machine where every soldier knew their role, every officer understood the grand strategy, and every victory reinforced their collective belief in absolute superiority. But here's where it gets fascinating. Hunyadi had identified the one crack in Mehmed's seemingly impenetrable armor: his pride. You see, Mehmed's greatest strength, his intellectual superiority, his perfect military record, his Renaissance education, was also his fatal weakness. He couldn't conceive of losing to what he saw as inferior European barbarians. Think about this from Mehmed's perspective. He had studied the great military minds of history: Alexander, Caesar, Hannibal. He had innovated beyond them with advanced artillery, superior logistics, and mathematical precision in warfare. Every European army he faced fought like it was still 1200 AD, using outdated tactics and feudal militias. Why would Belgrade be any different? Hunyadi understood something that modern psychologists now call cognitive bias. The more successful someone becomes, the more they expect success. And expectation makes you predictable. Mehmed's genius had become a prison of assumptions. What's brilliant is that Hunyadi didn't try to match Mehmed's intellectual prowess. Instead, he planned to use that very intellect against him. He was going to make Mehmed's rational, calculated mind work against itself. Hunyadi had identified the one crack in Mehmed's armor, and he was about to exploit it in the most brilliant way possible. The perfect bait. When news reached Europe that Mehmed was marching toward Belgrade with 40,000 elite soldiers, most people saw certain doom. Hunyadi saw the perfect opportunity, but first he needed the perfect bait. Enter John of Capistrano, a 70-year-old Franciscan monk who had spent his life preaching rather than fighting. To most observers, Capistrano seemed like an odd choice for military recruitment. But Hunyadi understood something crucial. He didn't need a military recruiter. He needed a psychologist who could convince ordinary people to play the most dangerous role in military history. Capistrano began recruiting what historians called a peasant army. But this wasn't random conscription. This was carefully targeted psychological recruitment. Farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, people who had never held a sword in their lives, but who possessed something that professional soldiers often lacked: genuine, raw, human emotion. Hunyadi understood the unique nature of this force. He knew he couldn't train them to be professional soldiers in mere weeks. Instead, he did something brilliant. He embraced their weakness, their genuine fear, their lack of discipline. These wouldn't be flaws to suppress, but strengths to channel. The peasant army wasn't designed to win battles through traditional strength. It was about to become an unpredictable wave of controlled chaos, a type of opponent that existed nowhere in the Ottoman military playbook. Hunyadi was turning fear itself into a weapon, creating what military strategists now call controlled chaos. But the genius goes deeper. Hunyadi understood that Ottoman soldiers had been conditioned through years of victories to expect certain types of opponents, either disciplined professional armies that fought predictably or completely disorganized mobs that collapsed immediately. They had never faced opponents who were simultaneously terrified and tactically effective. Every stumbling farmer, every panicked civilian was playing their part in a psychological operation that would make modern military minds jealous. This wasn't just about having more bodies on the battlefield. This was about creating a type of opponent that existed nowhere in Ottoman military training manuals. What's truly incredible is that Hunyadi trained these civilians not just to fight, but to fight in a way that would psychologically destabilize professional soldiers. They learned to channel their genuine fear into unpredictable aggression, to retreat in ways that looked panicked but actually drew enemies into traps, to fight with emotional intensity that couldn't be countered by disciplined formation fighting. Phase 1 of the trap was about to begin. The siege begins, or does it? July 1456. Mehmed's massive army surrounded Belgrade like a steel noose. To any observer, this looked like every other Ottoman siege: inevitable, methodical, unstoppable. The Sultan's engineers positioned their massive cannons, the same weapons that had shattered Constantinople's walls. His admirals commanded a river fleet that controlled the Danube. This was supposed to be a textbook victory. But let me tell you exactly what Mehmed was seeing and thinking, because this is where Hunyadi's psychological manipulation began. From Mehmed's perspective, Belgrade was just another medieval fortress, defended by a handful of Hungarian regulars, and what appeared to be a desperate collection of civilian volunteers. His intelligence reports confirmed what he expected: undermanned walls, limited artillery, no significant reinforcements coming. Mehmed set up his siege with the precision of a master craftsman. His cannons were positioned at mathematically calculated angles for maximum wall destruction. His infantry camps were organized in perfect geometric patterns that allowed for rapid deployment. His supply lines stretched back in orderly fashion toward Ottoman territory. Everything was exactly as it should be for a standard 2-week siege, followed by inevitable victory. But Hunyadi was playing a completely different game. While Mehmed celebrated his inevitable victory and planned his victory feast, Hunyadi was studying every single Ottoman move like a grandmaster analyzing chess positions. Here's what makes this absolutely brilliant. The siege itself was actually part of Hunyadi's psychological preparation. He wanted Mehmet to feel confident. He wanted the Ottomans to settle into their predictable siege routine. Because routine breeds complacency, and complacency makes you vulnerable. Inside Belgrade, while Ottoman scouts reported a typical siege scenario, Hunyadi was preparing a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. Rather than a rigid plan, this was a strategy of adaptability. He made his defenses look desperate and predictable, reinforcing Ottoman expectations. It was as if Hunyadi was programming Ottoman behavior, giving them exactly what their arrogance expected to see, setting them up for the moment when that expectation would become catastrophe. Modern military analysts studying Belgrade identify this as the first recorded example of what's now called strategic deception through expectation management. Hunyadi was essentially programming Ottoman behavior by giving them exactly what they expected to see, right up until the moment when expectation would become catastrophe. The psychological sophistication here is staggering. Hunyadi wasn't just hiding his true capabilities, he was actively shaping Ottoman perceptions to ensure they would make the exact tactical decisions he needed them to make. While Mehmet celebrated his inevitable victory, Hunyadi was studying every move, preparing for the moment when confidence would become catastrophe. Strike 1. The night that changed everything. July 21st, 1456, 2:30 a.m. While the Ottoman camp slept in comfortable confidence, Hunyadi launched what looked like a desperate sabotage mission. Hungarian forces struck the Ottoman artillery positions, destroying several of Mehmet's prized cannons and killing dozens of engineers. But let me break down exactly what happened during this night raid, because the tactical details reveal the psychological genius behind it. Hunyadi's raiders didn't attack randomly, they struck with surgical precision at specific targets designed to maximize psychological impact rather than military damage. The raid targeted the Ottomans' newest, most advanced cannons, the ones that represented Mehmet's technological superiority. But here's the brilliant part. They left older, less effective cannons completely untouched. This wasn't about crippling Ottoman firepower, it was about sending a very specific psychological message. We can strike exactly where we want, when we want, and your technological advantages won't protect you. The raiders also killed specific personnel, the master engineers who designed the cannon emplacements, and the artillery commanders who coordinated bombardments. But they avoided killing common soldiers or camp followers. This surgical precision created something far more unsettling than random destruction. It demonstrated intimate knowledge of Ottoman organization and the ability to strike at the command structure itself. To most observers, this was simple military necessity, disable the enemy's siege weapons. But this wasn't about cannon destruction. This was about psychology. Here's what makes this absolutely brilliant. Hunyadi knew that the Ottoman army's greatest strength was its psychological invincibility. For decades, they had crushed every enemy through sheer confidence and superior organization. Their soldiers didn't just fight, they fought knowing they couldn't lose. But that night raid, it planted something poisonous in the Ottoman mind: doubt. Suddenly, the desperate defenders weren't cowering behind their walls. They were striking back with knowledge, precision, and capabilities that didn't match Ottoman intelligence reports. The psychological impact spread through the Ottoman camp like a virus. Soldiers who had been joking about the quick victory began asking uncomfortable questions. How did they know exactly where our best cannons were positioned? How did they identify our most important engineers? What else do they know about our plans? Modern military psychologists call this psychological disruption, breaking the enemy's mental framework through unexpected actions that challenge fundamental assumptions. Mehmet's soldiers started questioning everything they thought they knew about their opponents. What's truly sophisticated is how Hunyadi calculated the exact level of damage needed. Too little, and the Ottomans would dismiss it as insignificant. Too much, and they might retreat or completely change their strategy. But the perfect amount of precisely targeted destruction created maximum psychological impact while ensuring the siege would continue according to Hunyadi's plan. The perfectly organized Ottoman camp began experiencing something they'd never felt before: paranoia. Sentries jumped at shadows, officers questioned their intelligence reports, command meetings that had been confident strategy sessions became nervous damage assessments. The myth of invincibility had its first crack. And here's the most brilliant part. This psychological disruption was exactly what Hunyadi needed for the next phase of his trap. He needed Ottoman soldiers who were off balance, uncertain, and most importantly, angry enough to make emotional rather than tactical decisions. But this was just the beginning of Mehmed's nightmare. The peasants strike back, July 22nd. What happened next defied everything anyone thought they knew about warfare. John of Capistrano's peasant army, remember, farmers and shopkeepers who supposedly couldn't tell a sword from a shovel, launched a coordinated attack on Ottoman positions that was so perfectly executed, it looked like choreographed ballet. But let me describe exactly what this looked like from the Ottoman perspective, because understanding their confusion is key to appreciating Hunyadi's genius. Ottoman soldiers were trained to fight two types of enemies: professional armies that followed predictable tactical patterns, or complete amateurs who collapsed at the first sign of organized resistance. What they faced at Belgrade was something that existed nowhere in their military experience. Civilians who fought with genuine terror and desperation, but whose terror had been weaponized into tactical effectiveness. These weren't soldiers following orders. They were emotional human beings channeling raw fear into focused aggression. Here's where Hunyadi's psychological genius reached its peak. The attack was designed to look chaotic while being absolutely controlled. Picture this: hundreds of civilians screaming, charging, appearing to panic and retreat, but somehow always striking at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right place, against exactly the right targets. The tactical sophistication is mind-blowing. Hunyadi had trained his peasant army to fight using what modern military theorists call swarm tactics. Small, independent groups that coordinate without central command, adapting to battlefield conditions through individual initiative rather than hierarchical orders. But the psychological element was even more sophisticated. These peasants weren't pretending to be afraid, they were genuinely terrified. But their terror had been channeled into unpredictable patterns that confused Ottoman soldiers who expected either disciplined formations or complete chaos. Ottoman commanders found themselves in a tactical nightmare. Their soldiers were trained to counter organized formations by breaking their structure, or to counter disorganized mobs by imposing discipline through superior organization. But how do you impose organization on opponents who are simultaneously terrified and tactically effective? How do you break the structure of fighters who have no structure to break? The Ottoman response reveals the psychological trap perfectly. They became frustrated, then angry, then desperate to reassert their superiority through overwhelming force. Every Ottoman reaction was exactly what Hunyadi had predicted and planned for. What's truly brilliant is that Hunyadi understood emotional contagion, how emotions spread through groups. The genuine fear and desperation of his civilian fighters created an emotional intensity that was impossible to fake and impossible for disciplined professional soldiers to counter using standard tactical procedures. Modern psychologists call this emotional warfare, using genuine human emotion as a tactical weapon. The peasants' terror wasn't a weakness to overcome, it was a strength to channel. Their desperation wasn't a liability, it was an asset that made them fight harder and more unpredictably than any professional soldier. Meanwhile, Ottoman commanders found themselves trying to counter tactics that didn't exist in any military manual. How do you defeat an enemy who fights with their heart instead of their head? How do you maintain discipline among your own troops when facing opponents whose very existence challenges everything they've been taught about warfare? The answer? You don't. You get frustrated, you get angry, and you make exactly the mistake your enemy is counting on. The psychological pressure on Ottoman commanders was mounting with every passing hour. Their soldiers were confused, their tactics were ineffective, and their reputation for invincibility was cracking with every successful peasant assault. Mehmed was about to make the exact mistake Hunyadi had predicted 15 years earlier. The kill switch activated. July 22nd afternoon. And here is where the story becomes even more incredible, because many historians believe what happened next wasn't part of any grand plan. Driven by uncontrollable religious fervor, A group of peasant crusaders disobeyed direct orders and launched a spontaneous, chaotic charge against the Ottoman lines. For any other commander, this would have been a catastrophe. An undisciplined mob breaking formation and attacking the world's greatest army? It was suicide. But for John Hunyadi, it was the opportunity his 15 years of experience had prepared him to recognize. In that single moment of pure chaos, he saw the pattern in the madness. While Sultan Mehmed II watched this chaotic peasant charge, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Frustrated, enraged, and seeing what he believed was the final, desperate act of a broken enemy, he did exactly what Hunyadi's deep understanding of his pride predicted he would. He ordered a massive, all-out assault to end the humiliation once and for all. Mehmed wasn't making a tactical choice. He was making an emotional one. And in doing so, he fell into Hunyadi's true trap. Hunyadi's kill switch wasn't a preset step. It was his decision to instantly weaponize the chaos his enemy couldn't understand. As Ottoman forces committed to their overwhelming attack, pouring through Belgrade's gates in massive formations designed to crush resistance through pure numbers, Hunyadi launched his masterstroke, a perfectly timed counterattack that hit the Ottoman army at the exact moment when they were most committed, most exposed, most unable to adapt. Here's the tactical genius. Ottoman soldiers were funneled through Belgrade's narrow streets, where their superior numbers became a liability instead of an asset. Their tight formations, perfect for open-field battles, became death traps in urban warfare. Their disciplined advance became a predictable target for defenders who knew every alley, every rooftop, every hidden position. But the psychological element was even more devastating. As the disciplined Ottoman formations encountered fierce resistance in the narrow streets, as their organized advance became a confused struggle for survival, as their overwhelming numerical advantage became meaningless in close-quarters combat, something unprecedented happened. Ottoman soldiers began to doubt their invincibility. What happened next was military history's greatest reversal. 40,000 elite soldiers, the terror of Europe, began to break and run from 700 defenders and a handful of peasants. The psychological collapse spread through Ottoman ranks like wildfire. Soldiers who had never experienced defeat suddenly found themselves in situations their training had never prepared them for. Mehmed himself was wounded in the chaotic fighting and forced to retreat, ending 150 years of Ottoman expansion into Europe in a single afternoon. The man who had conquered the unconquerable Constantinople found himself fleeing from peasants and a Hungarian commander who had turned his own intellectual brilliance against him. The retreat became a rout as psychological contagion spread through the Ottoman army. Soldiers abandoned their weapons, officers lost control of their units, and the most disciplined military force in the world dissolved into a panicked mob fleeing toward Ottoman territory. In 30 minutes, an empire's destiny changed forever because one man understood that the greatest victories aren't won with swords, they're won with psychology. The mastermind revealed. But here's what makes this victory absolutely legendary. Was it all a pre-written master plan? Almost certainly not. The reality is something far more impressive. It was a masterpiece of strategic intuition, a symphony of chaos conducted by a true grandmaster of war. So how did he do it? How did one man outthink the world's most powerful empire? The answer lies in layers of genius that were built not on paper, but in the crucible of battle over 15 years. Layer 1, the psychological database. While no literal psychological profiles were found in Hunyadi's papers, his mind itself was the database. For over a decade, he had been collecting priceless intelligence. Every captured Ottoman officer interrogated, every battle tactic analyzed, every victory and defeat had given him an almost supernatural feel for his enemy's rhythm, their predictable responses to fear, their commanders' reactions to humiliation, and their cultural obsession with honor and invincibility. Layer 2, weaponizing the enemy's strengths. Hunyadi understood that the Ottoman army's greatest assets, its perfect discipline, its rigid command structure, and its unwavering confidence, were also its most exploitable weaknesses. He didn't try to break their discipline, he used it to make their reactions predictable. He knew that when faced with the chaotic peasant charge, Their training would force them into a rigid, textbook response, funneling them exactly where he wanted them. Layer 3. The art of the calculated risk. The night raid on the cannons, the naval battle on the Danube, the final counterattack, these weren't desperate gambles. They were calculated risks based on a deep understanding of probability. Hunyadi knew that Mehmed's pride made a full-scale emotional assault highly probable. He wagered the fate of Europe not on luck, but on his certainty that a brilliant but arrogant opponent would eventually make a brilliant but arrogant mistake. Layer 4. Mastery of chaos. Hunyadi's ultimate genius wasn't in creating a perfect plan, but in his unparalleled ability to see and seize opportunity in the unpredictable storm of battle. When the peasants launched their spontaneous charge, another general would have seen a disaster. Hunyadi saw the key that would unlock the entire enemy army. What's truly staggering is that through pure battlefield intuition, Hunyadi effectively pioneered what we would now call psychological warfare. Not as a formal science from a textbook, but as a brutal art form learned through a decade and a half of survival. He proved that victory wasn't about having a better plan, it was about understanding your opponent's mind better than they understood it themselves. The siege of Belgrade wasn't just a military victory, it was a masterclass in turning an enemy's psychology into your most devastating weapon. Legacy, impact. Here's the final revelation that makes this story absolutely mind-blowing. Hunyadi didn't just win a battle, he demonstrated that human psychology is the ultimate weapon. Modern military academies still study the siege of Belgrade as a perfect example of asymmetric warfare, and it's astonishing how Hunyadi's tactics mirror principles now found in modern psychological operations manuals, from the CIA to special forces worldwide. The parallels extend even further. Silicon Valley entrepreneurs might not be studying Hunyadi directly, but the principles he demonstrated, how a smaller, more agile force can disrupt an overconfident giant by exploiting their predictable routines and psychological blind spots, are the very soul of startup strategy. Sports psychologists teach his methods for turning an opponent's mental pressure into a performance advantage. The Battle of Belgrade changed the course of European history, but more importantly, it proved that intelligence and a deep understanding of human nature could overcome any odds. In an age of swords and cannons, one man understood that the most powerful weapon isn't made of steel. It's knowing how the human mind works under pressure. Hunyadi proved that 700 defenders with the right psychological strategy could defeat 40,000 soldiers with superior weapons, training, and resources. He demonstrated that the greatest victories come not from matching your enemy's strengths, but from turning those very strengths into fatal weaknesses. Modern neuroscience has confirmed what Hunyadi understood intuitively. Human decision-making under stress is predictable, emotional responses follow patterns that can be exploited, and intellectual pride creates blind spots that skilled manipulators can target with devastating effectiveness. The siege of Belgrade wasn't just a military engagement, it was the first recorded example of warfare as applied psychology, strategy as human manipulation, and victory through understanding the enemy's mind better than they understood it themselves. Think about that the next time someone tells you the odds are impossible. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from being stronger, faster, or better equipped than your opponent, but from being smarter about human nature itself. What other impossible historical victories were actually masterful psychological traps? What modern situations can you think of where psychological strategy overcame material disadvantages? What would you have done in Hunyadi's position, knowing what you know now about human psychology? Let me know in the comments below, and if this blew your mind, hit that subscribe button because history is full of these incredible strategic masterpieces that most people never hear about. Remember, in the game of war, business, and life itself, the mind is the ultimate battlefield. And the person who understands psychology best doesn't just win, they make victory look inevitable.